Go ahead and have a seat. Welcome to Village Church. If it's your first time here, my name's Steve. I'm one of the pastors here at Village Church, and as always, I'm thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it to Matthew chapter 7. We're going to be starting in verse 24 this morning, finishing the Sermon on the Mount, as well as our series going through the book of Matthew, the first 7 chapters, rather. Next Sunday, we're going to be starting a series about the victory that we have in Christ and the victory that the gospel of Jesus brings us, and we're going to be doing that from Romans chapter 8. And then after that, I've entitled the season that we will be in the Christmas season, one of my most creative titles ever, I think, and that will begin, strangely enough, during the Christmas season. And so the last few weeks, we've been covering this really remarkable conclusion to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And much of the focus of Matthew 5 through 7 really has a focus on preventing hypocrisy in your life. If you've noticed something throughout these few chapters, Jesus hates phonies. He hates them. Jesus has no room for someone who is going to have a disingenuous faith in him. And so really the gearing of the Sermon on the Mount is to make you take introspection on your faith, to see whether it is valid or not, to see whether it is legit or not, to see whether or not it is a counterfeit faith that will actually exhibit itself in great hypocrisies happen in your life. And Jesus would have us to avoid that. And as he funnels down to this conclusion, he is radically exclusive, where we might even want him to be more inclusive. Because we love options, we love multiple choice, we love having many roads that we can take down and actually have them turn out okay. But Jesus always boils it down to either this or that. He always gives us two choices. In Matthew chapter 5, there were two forms of righteousness. Then there were two types of judgment. Then there were two masters that you can follow. Then there were two paths that lead to two different gates. And last Sunday, we took a look at two different types of fruit that your life can bear. And today, he's actually going to conclude with what I think is one of the hardest sayings of Jesus. He's going to talk to us about two different types of foundations that we can build our lives upon. One is the rock of Jesus Christ, and the other is the sand of disbelief. And really, when we're talking about this type of analogy isn't lost on us. It's just as relevant, if not more relevant now, than it was over 2,000 years ago when Jesus gave it. Because in our context, then most of you are of an age where you're either thinking about buying a house, you have bought a house, you've bought and sold a couple of houses, but most of us know the importance of the foundation on a house, especially when there is soil like there is in this town, where we deal with something that many people don't deal with, and that's shrink swell soil. Years ago, if you're not from here, I'll school you. Years ago, there was a dispute between the city and the county, and those disputes have never gone away, but this particular dispute was over taxes on drinking water in certain parts of our area, and the county responded by saying, that's fine, we'll just dig our own drinking water, and that's what the reservoir is. A reservoir is a man-made body of water. It hasn't always been there, and Chesterfield County dug it and then filled it in with water, and that's where you get your drinking water today. And actually, the reason that they chose the area that they did is because that was basically a swamp back in the day. And many of you who live on the land around it don't realize that you basically live on top of a swamp where a developer had the vision to bring in fill dirt and just filled in the swamp, and that's Brandermill. And so many of you have houses in Brandermill, and your house is on top of what was fill dirt, and they filled in the swamp. And what many of the people building the houses didn't foresee is that there would be some issues with the soil, where when it is raining a lot, the soil is one way, and then when we experience a season kind of like we're experiencing now, where it's pretty dry around here, the soil will shift in its dryness. But you can build a foundation for a house in a certain way to deal with those types of shifts, but they didn't build many of the foundations adequately to deal with it. And so many people in Brandermill have had to bring people in, and they've spent not just like a couple $100, but they've spent thousands and thousands and thousands, some even tens of thousands of dollars to address the foundation issues. And some of it has been great, and then other stories are that they addressed this issue, and then 5 years later, another issue with the foundation, they had to spend even more money. And Jesus likens the life that we build to a foundation. So many of us have HGTV vision. We go to look at a house and we're worried about the countertops. Is it man-made or is it, God-made? Is it granite? Is it quartz? Is it, some type of Superman material? I don't know what's out now. And then I had somebody come to my house one day trying to sell me windows, and he said there was krypton gas between the windows, and I was like, from Superman's planet? And he was offended by my question, and so I told him to leave. It's interesting thing is that I say a lot of offensive things, and I know I do, but if you're in my house, I'm just going to say whatever I want. And if you don't like it, well, bye. But the key is that so many of us, we look at the drapes, we look at the interior decorating, we look at the colors on the wall. And then I've actually had conversations even with staff members here, and they looked at all these things. They said, this is the best house ever, and it's such a steal. And then the inspector's report comes back, and they say, I didn't look at the foundation. And it's going to require thousands of dollars worth of work, and then you've got the decision, do I go ahead or do I cancel the contract? See, the foundation is something that isn't pretty. It's most of the time just cinder block, especially around here, and it's where the crawl space is, and we don't really want to go down there, especially me, because there's spiders and God knows what going on down there. And so I like the inspector. He can go down there, and I'll just maybe hold the flashlight at the door, if that. But we're more interested in what's going on above grade. We're more interested in what type of oven is it? Is it gas or is it convection? What's going on with all of that? Can we include the drapes in the contract? I want the washer and dryer. I want the refrigerator. And in the meantime, it could be that the house was actually built on a completely faulty foundation, and that's the last thing that you think about. But with Jesus, it's the first thing that he draws our attention to. Number one this morning, I want you to understand there's a difference between knowing and believing. Knowing is not the same thing as believing. Hear the words of Jesus starting in verse 24. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. For he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. Jesus says a few things that oftentimes we don't pay any attention to when we're actually talking about the story. We immediately go to, oh my goodness, the two different types of foundation, but Jesus kind of has a presupposition on top of that. You see, both of the audiences, those who built their house on the rock and those who would build their house on the sand, heard the same message. And Jesus actually points this out. He says, everyone who hears these words, both camps heard, both camps knew, but only one would believe. And that's the person that builds their house on the rock. See, my fear for many people, and especially for many of you, is many of you have been in church for a number of years, maybe even your entire life. Many of you have even been in this church for a number of years. You've heard message after message, sermon after sermon. You've attended many Bible studies. You might want to ignore that. Many Bible studies. You've been in community groups. You've been in discipleship groups. And you know the gospel. I could sit down with you and I could pepper you with question after question after question. And you'd probably get them all right. You'd probably be able to tell me all types of facts. Maybe you can say the books of the Bible forwards. Maybe you can say them backwards. Maybe you know all the words to Father Abraham had many sons, all right? And you think you're one of them. But knowing is totally different than believing, especially when your knowledge is no better than just the information on the back of a baseball card. I know a tremendous amount of things about this world. Anybody that's lived for 40 or more years, you pick up a little bit of knowledge along the way. I know how to eat and not get diabetes later, and I ignore it. Wholesale. I know that if I eat certain vegetables, it'll be good for inflammation and bad for the taste buds. I don't eat them. I know, but my belief has not exceeded my level of knowledge. My belief is lacking in certain things. See, many of you know enough about the gospel that you have convinced yourself that since you know the facts, then you believe. But the life that you are building stands contrary to that reality. You see, we like to look at the words of Jesus here and we imagine two types of people. There's the one person who hears the words of Jesus and believes, has his life radically transformed, follows Jesus all of his days, and that's the one on the rock. And then we look at the sand and we say, oh, that's the type of person that hears the gospel, rejects it wholesale, doesn't like Jesus, doesn't want to be a part of the church, and doesn't follow Jesus. But I don't think that's what Jesus is telling us, because Jesus actually describes two houses that look exactly the same. And he says they're going to experience the exact same storm, so the houses are probably really close together. And the fact of the matter is that from the exterior, untrained eye, you might think that these two houses are built on the same foundation. And Jesus points out, he says, and you won't realize that it's too late until it's too late when you see the ability that the house has to endure the storms that are sure to come. He says, then you will realize there is a difference between knowing the truth and believing the truth, because knowing the truth does not build within you any urgency or any feeling of responsibility to build a life on the foundation of that truth, and instead believes that you can just check off a few boxes, and as long as it looks good, you're great. In John chapter 14, Jesus says this, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. There are three distinct facts about faith here. The first one is that obedience doesn't necessarily equal faith. That obedience must be preceded by love. And that it is only love creating obedience that builds the life that Jesus wants, and a specific type of love, a love for Jesus Christ. See, some of you have the type of faith that makes perfect sense to human ears. You don't want to go to hell. Who would? And you want to do just enough to comfort yourself, to make you believe, I'm not going to end up in hell and I'm going to get heaven. But the life that you're building actually isn't predicated on a love for Jesus. It's just predicated on I don't want to go to hell. And so you have this little checklist. I went to church. I even served on a serve team. I went to a community group. Maybe I even went to a discipleship group. I've done enough to where I feel like my level of obedience is sufficient to comfort me and tell me that I am a Christian. Think about marriage. If I were to go home and I pulled out a checklist, I mowed the grass, I paid the bills, I picked up my underpants, I must be a great husband. What else can she expect of me? Have you ever had the thought, what else could God want from me? If that was my vision of marriage, I could expect a divorce. Actually, the problem with many of your marriages is that's your vision of marriage. It's a quid pro quo rather than a life of affectionate love. And the problem that you have with Jesus is that you expect things from Jesus in response to what you are doing, but there's absolutely no love for Jesus in your life. But note what he says in the end. He said it is love for Jesus that creates obedience to Jesus, and in that way, God responds by coming in, and here's that analogy, and he makes his home with you, a home of love, a home of affection. See, all of us can get this analogy because in our context, we understand that it is a home that is built for a family, and we want that home to be filled with love. And everybody realizes, even though some of you are experiencing it, there's nothing more miserable than being in a loveless home. It's terrible. No one has a vision for that. No one wants to marry someone and build a home and then have that love fall apart to where it's loveless. I have 2 children that love me. The problem is I'm a father of 3. It's tough. It's tough. My youngest, he's 3. He's about to turn 4. And he better change his tune, friends, or he's out. I can make another one, all right? I'm just saying, we've done it before. Do it again. But I look to him sometimes because I'm desperate to earn his love. Desperate for it. You don't understand the pain. I'm a weak man. And so what he doesn't get is that everything he owns, I bought. It's like, bro, I'm the man. You should love me over this. He doesn't. And I look to him sometimes and I say, I love you. Do you love me? No. Heartless, cold as ice, cold as ice, cold as ice. And it's like, man, it's like a dagger going through my heart. It's painful. And so I looked to him one day, I remember a couple of weeks ago, and I said, and a regular thing, I love you, do you love me? And of course he doesn't. And my wife says, I love you, do you love me? And of course, yes. She makes me sick. Kids love her so much. She's such a good mother. It's a joke, okay? I have to postscript some of my jokes now. You've been so offended over the past. But I say, do you love me? And he says, no. I say, I'm your friend. Are you my friend? And he says, no. Then he went too far, all right? He crossed the line that he didn't know existed, but I did. I said, I'm your father. Are you my son? No. I said, whoa! And he's 3. He should know better. He's had 3 years. But I looked at him and I said, oh, and there's a problem here. Only my children can live here. So I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to pack a few of your belongings and you're going to have to leave. Don't judge me. He looks at me and he started to understand the gravity of the situation. And I said, I'm going to ask you one more time. I'm your father. Are you my son? Yes. And I said, don't you forget it. But we have this longing inside of us, and I believe God put it there, where we want to be loved and we want the ability to love. And the key is that some of us are mistaken about our relationship with God. We believe that God has come in, like John 14 says, and he has made a home with us. It's just a strained relationship. We're just having some domestic, disruption. But here's what you need to understand, that if you don't have love and affection for Jesus, then he has not moved in. It's not that you have a strained relationship, it's that he's not there. It's that you have built a house and you have built a home of your own doing, and you haven't built it with Jesus in mind. And when you do not build it with Jesus in mind, it is because it is not on the foundation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have built your house on sand. J.C. Ryle, the great bishop, says this. He says, I doubt indeed whether we have any warrant for saying that a man can possibly be converted without being consecrated to God. More consecrated he doubtless will be, and can be as God's grace increases in his life. But if he was not consecrated to God in the very day that he was converted and born again, I do not know what conversion means. I read that quote for the first time when I was 19 years old, and it shook me. It caused me to take great inventory of my life, and so for 20 years, I've kept that quote close, and I read it frequently to take inventory of my life, to give a reality check into my life. But the problem that many of you have in your lives is you've never taken inventory, you've never looked at your foundation, you've never considered whether or not you truly have faith in Jesus Christ as defined by Jesus Christ, and instead you've come up with your own definitions. He is a God of your own making, and you've built your house on sand, and there is no love for Jesus. Well, friend, when there is no love, there is no foundation of the gospel. In 1 John, he puts it this way. He says, "By this we know that we've come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Whoever keeps his word, in him," note this, "truly the love of God is perfected." There's that love again. "By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides," and that word abides is the same idea as building a home. "Whoever abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." You keep his word because you love him. Do you? Number 2 this morning, your foundation determines how you endure storms. Your foundation determines how you endure storms. There's some misconceptions about Christianity from people outside of the faith, and even sometimes people inside of the church, that they believe that if you have faith in Jesus, then it is some type of cosmic storm blocker. That you follow Jesus, you'll never endure storms. That's not true. It's not a cosmic storm block, kind of like we think about sunblock. Every May, I have this activity that I do. My wife thinks it's foolish, but I often don't listen to her because she tells me a lot of what I do is foolish, and that's just unhelpful. But she tells me it's foolish because there's no scientific data to back up this practice, but I believe it's sufficient and right, so I do it. I have this activity called a preemptive burn, all right? And, oh, you don't know what that is? Well, I'll tell you. It's something that I developed. See, I have red hair. I don't know if you noticed that. It's kind of the color of fire. And people with red hair tend to have fair skin. Now, I don't have it as bad as some redheads have it, and that's because I'm blessed. But my skin has a little bit of a reddish complexion, and so I turn red. That's the only color I have. There's Steve red, and then there's sunburn. Those are just the two levels that I have. And so every May, I started doing this when I was a teenager. Every May, I wait until it's starting to get good and hot, and I'll wait until the sun's overhead, and I go outside, and I shed the shirt, baby. I just bear it all, much to my neighbor's chagrin. And because here's the deal you need to understand is that the less layers I wear, it doesn't get better. It gets phenomenally worse. But so whether I'm outside at home doing yard work or I go to the pool, I do it no sunscreen. And I do it for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, and I wait until I can be satisfied that I've gotten a good burn on. And then I go inside and I just deal with it for a couple of days. I'm sunburnt, but what happens is it creates a leather effect, all right, where for the rest of the summer, I've done my preemptive burn, and so no sunburn for the rest of the summer is going to be that bad. My wife has told me this is a bad idea, but since I came up with it, I assume it's a good one. And so I've been doing this for many years. Well, a couple of years ago, I went too far. Usually my idea is I'm eventually going to take it too far. And I did, and I got sun poisoning, and so I was sick as a dog, and I got blistered. I mean, it was a terrible thing. And so I've had to rethink some of my preconceptions about sunscreen. And so this summer, we went to the beach, and I'm telling you, I hate sunscreen. I hate the stuff. It's oily, and it's gross, and it takes forever to put on. And so we went to the beach, and my wife was like, why don't you put on some sunblock? And I was like, thinking about the disaster that had happened last year, I was like, okay, I'll put some sunscreen on. So I put some sunscreen on, all right? And it took me 13 hours, and by the time I was done, it was dark. But no, so I put on the sunblock, and we go down to the beach, and we're just having a great time. You know, we're looking at seashells, we're out in the water, we're having a blast. And my wife, if you don't know, my wife is Hispanic. All right? And that means that she has this thing in her skin called melanin. All right? And so she gets darker when she's in the sun for a long time. I just get redder. But there's more to it than that. If you don't have red hair, you probably don't know this. We feel every degree of the sun. All right? All of them. And so we had been outside for about a half hour, and my wife and my children, who have, some of her melanin and a little bit of mine, but not as much apparently, and they're picking up seashells, and I'm like lagging behind because I'm like, oh, sweet Lord, we're in an oven. And so I'm looking at my wife, and I'm like, how are you not hot? And she says, it feels great out here to me. And I'm like, I hate you. But so I'm baking in an oven, but then we went inside. We'd been out there for a couple of hours. I took a shower to get all that nasty sunscreen off of me, and then I get out of the shower, and I'm like, I'm not burnt. So I go outside to my wife, and I'm like, you'll never believe this, Jesse. Sunscreen works. She was nowhere near as impressed as I was with that, and she just looks at me and she says, I know. Pray for us. But what you need to understand is that Jesus and faith in him doesn't cause a block for life's realities. If anything, Jesus has actually told us that if you're going to follow him, you can expect to suffer more. Because there will be suffering, there will be persecution, there will be hardships. Following Jesus does not deter any of that. You will experience relational turmoil. Your children will disappoint you. Someone you love may betray you. Someone you love may walk out of the door and abandon you. You may hear a message from the doctor that you do not care to hear. You may actually even, where church history is concerned, you may suffer persecution because of your faith in Jesus Christ. And I have watched people with both foundations endure the exact same storms. But it's a stark contrast. None of them want to suffer. No one wants to experience a storm and a hardship of life, but I've watched people who love Jesus, who believe the gospel, who have faith. I have watched them suffer hardships. You can't even imagine the darkness that they have walked through, and I've been with them and I've watched them. They don't want to go through this, but they are. But here's the difference. They experience it with hope that they will come out on the other side. They experience it with the promise that Jesus gave, that all of this will work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose, that there will be a day, even if it is not until Jesus delivers his kingdom in entirety, they will experience pleasure once again. And I've also walked through the exact same experience with people who have the facade of faith, but their foundation is sand. And they don't have the same hope. They don't have the same confidence. They don't have the same thought that Jesus will bring himself glory through this. And I'm not comfortable, but I'll walk with him. More often than not, what I've experienced with people who have a foundation of sand is that they ask a question that's devastating. Why would God do this to me? How could God allow this to happen to me? You see, friends, so many of us, we build our house, it's our life, with no thought about our foundation. We're doing what we want. We're doing what's going to make us happy. We're doing what makes me comfortable. We're doing what will get me the most out of it. And then when the storm comes, we look to God and say, do something. And we think God is going to pick the house that we put on sand up and magically put it on the foundation of the gospel. And when he doesn't, We blame him. And all the while, God warned us, and he warned us here. He said, build the house on the foundation of the gospel, and you will endure it. Because if you wait until the storm comes, you will not be able to rebuild that house. It can't magically go on the foundation of the gospel when the storm is nailing you. Because God said you need to prepare for the storm when the sun is shining. But we were too preoccupied with knowing the gospel, but not applying the gospel. Because it's only through application that you believe. Your foundation determines how you endure storms. You see, though, the problem is that we only have one type of storm in mind. But Jesus elsewhere actually gives us a second type of storm that we're going to have to deal with in life. Jesus gives another parable, and it's called the parable of the sower. And it's about this sower who goes out and he's got seed and he's casting the seed around. And he gives four distinct realities, and in the middle he gives us the two that are applicable to today. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 20, he reveals that he's talking about the gospel and what real faith in the gospel looks like. And he says, there will be phony faiths. He says, what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation and persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. And that's what we think storms look like. But Jesus gives another, verse 22. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Storms don't always take the form of pain and adversity. Because I know some of you, you live in an affluent culture, and some of you, you've avoided pain your entire life. And you might think, well, I've never experienced anything hard, therefore, God's good. I've never experienced any hardship, therefore, everything must just be all right. I've had a good life, and nothing bad is really happening to me. You are experiencing storms, just of a different type. Affluence without a life built on the foundation of Jesus is a curse. And in our culture, that is one of the hardest things you can possibly believe. Why do you think Jesus elsewhere says that it is harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? You're experiencing storms. But sometimes storms look strangely like affluence. Riches, or what Jesus calls it, he calls it the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches, can choke out your faith just as easily as suffering. Because you are tempted again to build your life, build your mission, build your purpose on a false notion and identity. You build it on the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches, but here's the key, in the end you will crumble. You will not endure. It's just a different type of storm that will leave you destroyed in the end. So what do? Build your life like Jesus is Lord. Amen. Build your life like Jesus is Lord, because he is. You see, Jesus had this strange way of discipling people. I think you would find it offensive, because sometimes people come into the church and they're like, I want discipleship, and then we'll start discipling them and they'll be like, oh, this is too rudimentary for me. I'm beyond this. And I always feel like looking at them saying, man, Jesus would have frustrated you, because he dealt with the most religious of cultures, and he always started with square one. Always. One time he's having a conversation with his disciples. These are guys he lived with, all right? These are guys that spent all their time with him. And he looks to him and he says, who does everybody say that I am? And they threw out a couple of things. And then he looks at him. It's a discipleship moment, and he says, who do you say that I am? And as always, Peter's the first one to speak up. This time he got it right. But what's interesting about this is in a few verses later, what he got right, he would get dreadfully wrong, and then Jesus would call him Satan. All right, here's the deal. You know you've gone down a bad road if Jesus says you're Satan. All right, just a little word to the wise. That's not what you want Jesus to say that you are. But Peter responds to the question when Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And he says, you are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. And Jesus is basically like, bingo. But then he says, and on this rock, I will build my church. See, Jesus was saying that it is about who he is that the church will find its identity on. That the foundation of the church must be consumed, absorbed, and saturated in the reality that Jesus is the Christ, that he came to redeem, that he came to restore. He is King. He is God. But if you build your life on anything else, it's the sand. Jesus finishes his analogy. And then the text tells us that the crowd was astonished. And I find that interesting because this is a crowd, keep in mind, that was very religious. It was steeped in Judaism. This is a crowd, many of the people in it could probably recite from memory the entire Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And they were astonished because his teaching had an uncommon authority and was nothing like the teachings of the scribes. And the scribes weren't all bad guys. The scribes are actually responsible for why we have such a good copy of the Old Testament today. But they were astonished because in all of their religion, in everything that they knew, Jesus dared to ask a question and demand an answer. And his question was, will you build your house on the gospel? Or will you just know the facts? Some of the crowd heard Jesus and knew what he had said. They knew it. And some of the crowd believed. And there's no third way. There is no way to soften the blow of what Jesus says here because it destroys so many of our conceptions about faith. It destroys so many of our conceptions about what we think following Jesus is all about. It destroys so many conceptions about what we think an allowance for us to give Jesus this much of my life, but I don't have to give Jesus this much of my life. And if I give Jesus this much, then I'll be okay with him, checking it off the list, checking it off the list, checking it off the list. But I'm going to do whatever I want over here. And Jesus looks at us and he says, who do you think you are? Because some of us, we will even have the audacity to try to take a double-wide trailer and put it on the foundation of Jesus' mansion and say, everything's okay. My house doesn't fit on his foundation, but it's okay. And then as soon as a storm comes, washes your house right away. Because you have to build it according to his instructions, according to his design. Years ago, when a few tsunamis hit Asia, I was fascinated by the videos of it because it wasn't what the movies taught me it was. It's kind of like, quicksand. We thought that was going to be a way bigger deal than it actually was. I still haven't hit it. But a tidal wave is not like this 600-foot wave up in the air that just falls on top of a city. No, it's far more subtle than that. Tidal wave really just starts as water coming too far inland and it's up to your ankles, and then 10 seconds later, it's over your head and moving so fast that you're a mile away from where you stood and you drown. I mean, it's devastating in its subtlety. And these videos have made their way to YouTube of people in Japan taking videos of a tidal wave coming in. I was watching one day, and it was amazing. Terrible, but amazing still the same. Where you just all of a sudden start to see water on a street that was dry, and then you can't see the street anymore. Then you see cars going down forced by the water. And then by the end of the video, you're seeing roofs go down with the water. And it's not that the roofs were detached. It's that the house is underwater and it didn't have a foundation because it was in an impoverished area or poor people built it and didn't have the means to give it a good foundation. And you just watch this devastation as an entire village is just swept away because they never thought it was going to happen. No one thinks their house is going to crumble in the storm. We all assume everything's going to work out in the end. Jesus wants you to deal with the stark and sobering reality that it might not. There's no way for me to soften this blow. Jesus means to make you question your faith. Jesus means to force you to do something that some of you have been avoiding for a very long time. Jesus is forcing you to deal with whether or not you are actually one of his followers. And I know what's happening in some of your minds right now. That inner defense attorney is starting to rear his head, and you're thinking, well, no, because of this, no. I'm really a believer. I'm really a Christian. No. Here's the I think I am. If you have to convince yourself you're a Christian, I want you to consider the reality that you aren't. You shouldn't have to convince yourself that you're a Christian. You should just believe. So many times I've seen so many people be so foolish with their lives where they just begin to weigh things out and they say, what more could God expect of me? I must be a Christian. And there's really no evidence. Friend, you need to deal with the reality. How are you building your life? Why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why are you headed in the direction you are headed? What is your mission? What is your purpose? Because my fear for you is that in reality, none of the answers to those questions have anything to do with Jesus. And if we found out tomorrow that the gospel isn't true and that Jesus isn't God, then nothing of your life would change except that you would have a few more hours on Sunday morning to do whatever you want to do with it. Yeah. What are you building your foundation on? Only you can answer that. Every Sunday, we reflect on the truth of the gospel by partaking in communion. It is why we can follow Jesus. The plate in the front and in the back has bread on it that represents the broken body of Christ, and the cup represents his shed blood. So there's nothing I can do to save myself. There's nothing I can do to make myself good enough for God. The only way that I can build a life on the foundation of Jesus is if I believe that he came, lived a perfect life that I cannot live, died as a substitute for me, paying the penalty for my sin, and then he rose from the dead to give me a new life. That's the only way I can begin to construct a life on his foundation. And it's the only way you can do it. Friend, if you're in here and you're struggling with doubt, if you're in here and you can't really answer the question as to whether or not you're building your life on the foundation of Jesus, or you're in here and you know that you aren't, I don't want you to feel like you have to fake it. I don't want you to come up here, go back there and eat and drink and lie. I don't want you to do that. I want you to take a step of faith, and maybe for the first time in your life, I want you to be honest enough to admit you are not following Jesus. If that's you, then in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to walk out into the foyer rather than eating and drinking. There'll be somebody there that loves you, that would love to talk with you, that would love to explain the gospel to you, that would love to pray with you. You can become a follower of Jesus today. Amen. Why wouldn't you? He loves you more than you can realize, and he's done everything that needs to be done for you to begin to build a life on his foundation. But if you are a follower of Jesus, I won't put any barrier up that Jesus has torn down. Come, eat, drink, proclaim your faith in Christ, then go. And you better build a life on His foundation. When you're ready, come.